All right, hello everybody. Today I am talking about another book that was something that Lovecraft mentioned in that essay of his, supernatural horror in literature, something like that. I've referenced it before. You all know what I'm talking about. He talked for a paragraph or two about an author named William Hope Hodgson, and he said, quote, "Perhaps the greatest of all Mr. Hodgson's works," end quote, was The House on the Borderland. Lovecraft had a little bit of praise with a little bit of caveat to it for Hodgson. He said, quote, "Of rather uneven stylistic quality, but vast occasional power in its suggestion of lurking worlds and beings behind the ordinary surface of life. Perhaps second only to Algernon Blackwood in his serious treatment of unreality." Those are the words that Lovecraft gave to William Hope Hodgson, and this book was supposedly one of his best works, so I figured I'd give it a look and see what it is. And let's see, what can I say about the book in particular? It looks like it was published in 1908, so it was, early 1900s. It starts out very slow and almost trite in a way, where there's two people that have gone off into a wilderness area, and they find a book kind of thing. But despite this kind of rocky start, this is one of the strangest books that I have read in a long time. With that strangeness both working for and against it at times. For its literary quality, basically. It's a relatively short novel. The ebook reader that I used gave it 200-ish pages, a little more than that, and they're short pages, so it's not a very long book. And kind of gathering from the classic style, it both starts and ends with short poems. The opening starts with this: "Open the door and listen, only the wind's muffled roar, and the glisten of tears round the moon, and in fancy the tread of vanishing shoon, out in the night with the dead. Hush, and hark to the sorrowful cry of the wind in the dark. Hush and hark, without murmur or sigh, to shoon that tread the lost aeons, to the sound that bids you to die. Hush and hark, hush and hark." So already we're in kind of relatively weird territory. As I got into this book, I realized that this is a weird tale for weird tales. I don't know if they ever republished it in Weird Tales, but it's a perfect fit for that magazine. It is the story of a strange old house in the rural parts of Western Ireland. The book has two point of view characters, one of which is kind of like present day, and the other one is some indeterminate past. And the present day people say that they are 40 miles. They're in Western Ireland, and they are 40 miles from Ardrahan, which is a castle, I guess, that has a rail station near it. And apparently this house is at the center of some very strange phenomena. Whether they happened or not is unclear. It could be the product of madness. We don't really know. What I will say about the story is it has some of the most varied pacing that I've seen. Some of the biggest shifts that I've ever read in any book. We go from, relatively dry, hey, two guys out fishing, looking around in the wilderness, to, an old man having a crazy dream quest, to, gun battles, back to dream quests, and all over the place. It goes slow, it goes fast, it goes slow, it goes fast. It's all over the place pacing wise. As for tone and style, it has that kind of familiar, dry English gentleman kind of tone and style. But like I said, there are two POV characters: one who is a young present day guy, and one who is an old man who was an old man probably 100 years ago, kind of thing. So I figured I'd just read a short paragraph from each character to kind of give you a feel for this. From the young Mr. Berignog. Yes, the end of his name is Eggnog. From young Mr. Berignog. "It had taken us all day to accomplish our journey over some of the roughest tracks imaginable, with the result that we were thoroughly tired and somewhat bad-tempered. However, the tent had to be erected and our goods stowed away before we could think of food or rest, and so we set to work with the aid of our driver, and soon had the tent up upon a small patch of ground just outside the little village, and quite near to the river. So as you can see, this is kind of a dry tone. It skims over a lot, right? It had taken us all day to accomplish our journey. Well, that could have been a whole paragraph or a whole chapter or something. Some of the roughest tracks imaginable. Rough how, rough why, that kind of stuff. Thoroughly tired and somewhat bad-tempered. That is a very detached way to describe people being in a bad mood. So we see that the main character, that the young Mr. Barrignog is kind of a dry narrator. Not a whole lot of investment or passion. It's kind of detached. It's descriptive without kind of being passionate about description, if that makes sense. The old character, who never gets named in the book, is a little bit more fanciful, a little bit more melodramatic, a little bit more close to madness. Quote, "I must have been here some 10 years before I saw sufficient to warrant any belief in the stories current in the neighborhood about this house. It is true that I had on at least a dozen occasions seen, vaguely, things that puzzled me, and perhaps had felt more than I had seen. Then, as the years passed, bringing age upon me, I became often aware of something unseen, yet unmistakably present, in the empty rooms and corridors. Still, it was, as I have said many years before, I saw any real manifestations of the so-called supernatural." So that's our old POV character through the middle part of the book. As you can see, he's a little bit more descriptive, a little bit more in tune with things, and he needs to be, because otherwise the story would not be nearly as interesting as it was. I mean, there's a lot of description in this book, but sometimes there's so much description that it almost interferes with the progression of the story. He goes on, the narrator, whoever he happens to be, goes on and on and on about something that seems relatively close to irrelevant, whereas, when something really crazy happens, it gets a couple of sentences here, and you're like, well, you could have spent some more time on that. Why didn't you spend some more time on that? We have a fairly kind of long paragraph style. One thing about this book that I found surprising was that there's almost no character development of anybody in the story. It is very much a kind of detached, weird tale. We don't feel like we're on the side or in the shoes of any of these characters. Another thing that was interesting about this book was the sheer mass of unanswered questions and kind of deliberately unprovided answers. There's definitely a feel that the author is trying to get you to kind of use your imagination with him a little bit, but that does end up making things a little bit vague sometimes, and so, I can guess at what the author was trying to get at, but at the same time, maybe I'm wrong, who knows, right? So, you don't get a lot of closure on the things that are left as open questions. In fact, this book has such a disjointed structure to it that it almost feels like an anthology at times. There's at least 3 very different stories that are held together by very slender threads of narrative. And that, again, is something that can be interesting, but at the same time it can cause the cohesiveness of the book to suffer. And I think it does make the cohesiveness of this book suffer a little bit, especially when some of these parts kind of overstay their welcome, which I'll get into later on. We start out with an extremely, extremely slow pace that suddenly gives way to frantic action, and then back to slow, and then fast, and then slow, and then weird, and then fast, and then slow. It's kind of all over the place. There are these sections of the book that are kind of like Lovecraft's Dream Quest kind of writing, where we get these multiple parts of the story where something very weird is happening, and the point of view character is just observing it for the most part. And sometimes these drag on to the point where they're almost they almost overstay their welcome. In fact, I kind of say that one of them does overstay its welcome, because you're kind of like, yes, I get it, I understand what is happening. Can you move on to the next part of like what is actually how the character is gonna react, or how this is going to affect the story or the plot or the themes or anything like that. Or whatever, something. Just stop describing the same thing over and over to me and expecting me to, really, really care about this repetitive description. There is a little bit of that, which, again, the weirdness of this book both works in its favor sometimes, and sometimes you get the feeling that there's some literary failings here, where the author wanted to do something, but he didn't implement it or accomplish it, what he was trying to do. We get some of these surprising jumps from narrative to narrative. One character will be talking about one thing, and then we'll switch over to this other guy, and he'll do this thing, and then all of a sudden something else will happen. Some of these things are sudden, and that makes them interesting in a way, but at the same time, some of them are so abrupt that you're like, well, maybe a little build-up would have been nice. A lot of these plot elements, I mean, this book was published in 1908, so a lot of the plot elements that we're seeing in this story were new then, relatively new. Certainly there may have been other authors who wrote things that were similar to this, in the decades beforehand, but it wasn't trite at the time that Hodgson was writing, and so I can't fault him for that. This is actually a very creative book in a way, because a lot of the things that happen in it kind of remind me of short stories that were very creative that came much later on. And so if those short stories were creative, what is this book that came 50 years earlier compared to that, right? So, that's a good point, a point in its favor. My overall impression of this book is mildly positive. Interesting for someone who is interested in the history of supernatural horror in fiction. Interesting for people who are fans of Lovecraft and want to kind of get a feel for what Lovecraft himself was reading and was interested in. Good for people who like reading these old stories and seeing the origin of things that are tropey now. From a literary, from an analytical perspective, it's interesting. From a reader's perspective, it has its problems. From a modern reader's perspective, if you didn't know that this book was written in 1908, you would call it trite, which is, again, something that we have to take into account, both when it was published and whether it has staying power after being published, right? So, anyway. With that, I think we'll move into the spoiler section, and I'll talk about things in a little bit more detail. Of course, you can skip the section if you don't want spoilers. All right, spoiler section. So, this book begins with a poem that I read in the non-spoiler section, but it begins with a usual kind of early 1900s. Hey, I got this manuscript from some friends of mine who went blah 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 blah. Signed William Hope Hodgson. So it's the usual kind of Burroughs style intro. Then we actually get into the actual main story, where we start with two young. I guess they must be Irish or something like that. I'm not sure about the name etymology, so forgive me about that. But there's our point of view character named Berignog and his friend Tonneson, and they head to a remote village called Creighton, Kraighten, to go camping and fishing for a little while. And what ends up happening, effectively, is that, first off, they're more isolated than they think, because the people of the village don't speak English at all. They only speak, like dialect, Irish, and they don't understand Berignog or Tonneson at all. They go fishing for a bit, they kind of give them some fish as a peace offering kind of thing, but all in all, there's very little that they can communicate with the villagers at all. So they start kind of exploring around, and they find this very strange and creepy kind of chasm. And they even find a few bits of what looks like a ruined building, like a brick, the remains of some kind of brick post or something like that. Tonneson goes around with a shovel and starts digging at things, and he digs up what looks like, or what is, a damaged manuscript. Some bunch of pages that were written God knows when, and Tonneson shows this to Berignog, and basically they're like, oh, let's read the manuscript, or what is left of the manuscript. And then the story completely vanishes away from them, and the POV switches to this unnamed recluse character. He's referred to as the Recluse by the notes that Berignog and Tonneson have added to the manuscript. So, I'll just call him the Recluse. He is an old man who lives in this house, presumably the one that no longer exists, with his elderly sister Mary and his dog Pepper. And this is a big old mansion that used to stand where Berignog and Tonneson are hunting and camping and fishing. The narrative of the old man kind of has that starts out with that standard journal thing. I am writing a diary because blah 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 blah. And it starts out with some kind of mildly weird ghost story stuff, flickering candles, some weird colored lights, noises and shadows, that kind of thing. Nothing too crazy. But then at some point, the recluse is just kind of sitting there, and like his consciousness gets ripped out of his body, and he goes on basically what is a dream quest. Now, the thing about this is that, like, Lovecraft did a very good job of making sure that his language during these dream quests was vivid, beautiful, and, like, descriptive, right? And like, engaging. And I'll say that Hodgson's language during this dream quest is not especially compelling. It's not like I felt a sense of awe at what he was describing. In fact, I kind of found myself getting a little bit bored about it as he kind of went on and on and on about minutia, as opposed to moving things forward as to what was going on. He kind of flies across space, and he ends up at this kind of, like, he calls it an arena. It's a big rounded slab of flat land. It has a couple of buildings on it, and what he observes there is that collected in this arena are statues of various gods of death. There's the Egyptian god of death. I think he says Osiris. And then there's the Hindu god of death, which he, Kali, I believe. And he says there's all kinds of statues of different gods of death, and he wonders, this statue over here, this thing that I've never seen before, I wonder what, crazy civilization or cult saw this as its god of death. And, since we're in the spoiler section, I can say that what I think Hodgson is getting at is that, like, this arena is the place where of, like, the greatest things or something like that, and the gods of death are the greatest things because everything dies, even universes. So I'll get a little bit more into detail in the next dream quest, but for now, this is kind of what I gathered from it. As he flies around this arena, he suddenly comes upon this gigantic pig creature, like pig-man creature, ManBearPig, right? And, at first it doesn't notice him, and he's just kind of looking at it, and then suddenly it notices him, and it charges him. And right before it gets to him, he flies straight up. And this is another problem with the dream quest aspect of it here, is that throughout the dream quests in this story, the recluse, the POV character, doesn't really seem to have any agency. He's just kind of an observer. He's kind of drifting around under, being blown around by the wind, so to speak, and he doesn't really have any control over what's going on. He's just kind of the observer. And that's another thing that kind of makes this story hit a little less hard, because the characters, generally speaking, don't seem to have much agency. The recluse will have some agency later on, but it's kind of like a short thing during an action scene, and, you kind of wonder what anybody else would be expected to do in that case, and how the recluse's actions were unique, and they're kind of not, really. But anyway, so he flies straight up. He has no control over this. He's like, oh no, I'm going to die. The thing is gonna... And then suddenly he flies up in the air. He flies back to his body. He lands in his body. He wakes up at his house. The thing is that this dream quest starts to kind of tie together the weird things that he's been seeing in his mind. And what this causes him to do is to go outside and start looking around. He has all these kind of overgrown gardens around the house that nobody really tends to, but they're kind of mysterious and scary. He finds a pit, and it sounds like it's the same pit that Berignog and Tonneson found. And he kind of goes to explore the pit. He spends a lot of time trying to devise a way to kind of climb down it and all that stuff. But what he finds is he seems to find, like, a miniature version of that pig monster. And, like, it's kind of only a fleeting glance. He, like, sees it and it runs off into the shadows, kind of thing. Kind of trying to be mysterious, but not really doing a great job of it. Because what ends up happening is that the pig creature, or pig creatures, as they appear to be multiple of them, start to come out of the pit and encroach on his house. So he ends up basically barring himself and his sister and his dog in the house, and, like, gathering a bunch of rifles and stuff, and trying to, like keep the pig creatures out, and maybe shoot at them if he can. He goes out on the roof and he shoots at one of them, kind of stuff. There's all kinds, like, we get this action scene, which is, the pace is quick and interesting, but, like, it's I don't know, it felt out of place compared to the previous part of the book. We have this slow, observant pace. And then suddenly there's a crazy old man who had a dream about flying across the universe yesterday, and now he's, climbing out on his roof and shooting at pig creatures that are pounding on his door. And of course we get the usual thing where, like, oh yeah, he shoots them and he hears them scream, but then when he goes out to check, there's no bodies. Oh, stuff like that. So we get this big battle. The pig creatures start to break into the house. He finds out that there's like this trap door in his cellar that the pig creatures are maybe trying to get in through. So he puts some slabs of stone on that. And after a couple of days of this, it appears that the pig creatures are gone. They've been scared away. There's this weird thing going on where, like, his sister Mary sees him and, like, screams and faints, and she's, like, scared of him for some reason. And as far as I can tell, this is never, like, resolved in the story. It's just like, oh yeah, she was scared of me for a few days for some reason. But, like, it gives you the hint that, like, maybe he's crazy, but, like, at the same time, it's not clear whether he's crazy or not, or whether these pig creatures really exist. And, of course, the fact that he already saw one of them, saw the gigantic pig creature is like, it's like, well, yeah, I mean, either we're working with a unreliable narrator or not. But if we're working with an unreliable narrator, then you need to punch things up a little bit, I guess. After the stuff with the pig creatures is done, he kind of, he goes back to his study and he's sitting and writing stuff. And all of a sudden, bam, another dream quest. And this is a different one from the first one. Instead of flying out of his body, he feels like he's still in his body. What happens instead is that he kind of starts to travel faster and faster through time. And so we get, like, paragraphs and paragraphs of him describing what it looks like for time to be going faster. He talks about how, I can see a tail on the sun. It's moving so fast across the... And then he's like, now it's just a ribbon, and it's moving back and forth as the seasons change from north to south. How, all this detail. And then, he talks about how this is the part that really drags on, because he keeps describing this, and you're like, okay, I get it. What's the interesting part? Like, sure. But what ends up happening is he kind of goes through the entirety of the rest of the life of the universe. He survives long enough to see all of the animals die. There's this moment where his dog, Pepper, is just laying there at his feet, and he, like, goes to touch Pepper to see if Pepper's okay, and Pepper collapses into dust. And, it's like very, it's a very graphic scene, I guess. It's not graphic because it just turns into dust. It's not like it explodes into gore or anything like that, but it's kind of an unsettling scene. And he's like, I sure hope that Pepper's actually okay. I'm kind of feeling like I'm going to get out of this dream thing at some point. But he basically goes through, like, Hodgson's perception of what the rest of the time of Earth is, right? Like, millions and millions of years pass, the sun starts to die out, the moon flies off on its own, the Earth becomes cold. The Earth becomes so cold that we get, like, the air descending in solid form to the surface of the Earth as snow, which, he's like, there's more snow, and there's snow inside for some reason, and I can't hear anything now because there's no gas air to transmit sound. We get a bunch of kind of crazy, but also kind of fun-ish sometimes, astronomical phenomena and theories about what the universe structure is actually like. In the end, the Earth kind of flies around this, like, green star, which Hodgson says is the star at the center of the universe. There's these weird, like, puffs of like spheres of light kind of thing that fly around, and he goes through one of those. At this point, we're like in a pure science fiction tone, and the shift from weird story, I'm killing pig monsters outside my house, to I am observing the end of the universe in a dry science fiction tone is actually kind of jarring. We get these hints that the old man has like a lost lover, some woman that he loved who died or went away or something like that. And, this adds a little bit of flavor to his character, but there's not enough there for a reader to really sink their teeth into. They're just like, I'm so sad that she is gone, and I wish I could stay with her forever, and blah, 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 blah. It's a little bit melodramatic, and it's not really developed in a way that allows it to be particularly interesting. It's just kind of this vague sense of longing that kind of flips on and off like a switch, right? Like, I remember her, and then like a couple paragraphs later, it's done. So the recluse comes back from this dream quest. He reawakens in his house, his present day, and it, like, for some reason, Pepper is still dust. Like, the dog is dead, and his reaction to this is very weird and creepy, where he's like, oh, I'm going to leave that pile of dust there untouched forever. He's like, oh, I got to keep the cleaning lady out. I got to make sure my sister doesn't try to sweep up this dust. And, and I'm also going to buy a new dog, but I'm going to make sure that the dog isn't allowed into the study where it could mess up this pile of dust that once was my beloved dog, Pepper. And then all of a sudden the pig thing returns. And now it's not the miniature one, it's like a big one. The pig thing, like, attacks the recluse's new dog and, like, puts a hand on it, right? And the guy sees, oh, I see that the wound on the dog is not like a claw, but like the shape of a hand, as if you kind of like, just touched something and left a spot of like this luminescent greenness on the side of the dog that is, very, very painful and bad for the dog. And then even worse, the green wound starts to turn like moldy. He talks about it like growing like a white, mold-like growth on it. And so he has to put the dog down. And then he's like, oh no, wait, the dog licked me. And he's like, oh no, my arm is, and then the journal ends. And it's like, and you're like, oh, that was abrupt and a little bit strange and not really that satisfying, because then we hop right back to Berignog and Tonneson, and they finish their vacation and leave. They have the driver that helped them set up the tent the first time. When he comes back to pick them up, they have him ask the villagers about whether or not there was a big house that once stood where they were, camping. And the driver's like, yeah, there was a big ill-omened house here a long time ago, and the villagers don't really remember about it, but they say that their grandfathers kind of had stories about this weird house. And then the book just kind of ends. So, yeah, it is a weird book. As you can see, it's a weird book, and it has so many different elements kind of jam-packed into it and handled, sometimes decently well and sometimes kind of mediocrely. That it's not really the rip-roaring read that I was hoping for, but nor is it the boring, dry book that I expected from the first couple of chapters. So, anyway, that is the spoiler section. We'll move on to the conclusion. So, in conclusion, as I said in the non-spoiler section, this is one of the strangest books I've ever read. The strangest book I've read in a long time. It is both strange in the subject matter sense and in like the literary choice sense, right? The things that the author is describing are weird. And, they're weird in ways that, were written in later short stories and novels and novellas and seen as, greatly creative then. So what was this in 1908? It was incredibly creative in a sense. But at the same time, some of the way that things are written and the literary choices that are made are also strange in the sense that there's a lot of creativity packed into this book, but the execution is kind of subpar, which gives me this really weird ambivalent feeling about it. Like I should be saying, wow, this book is really creative, but then at the same time, it's not as well written as I would hope. And at the same time, there are elements of it that are kind of well written. And if you want to know more about this kind of world building that Hodgson's trying to do, that's really cool too. So it's like, I'm really kind of like hot and cold on this book. I mean, like, there are some action parts that are swift and fun to read, but they're not the majority of the book. They're deeply in the minority of the book. There's the Dream Quest parts that have some really interesting ideas in them, but really questionable execution. At some point, I was reading one of the Dream Quest portions, and I had understood what Hodgson was trying to say. I was, I get it. He's trying to explain that this is what's happening. Cool. And then just paragraph after paragraph after paragraph of the same thing kind of being stated again. I started imagining the Monty Python bit from the Quest for the Holy Grail, where like everyone is like, get on with it, right? That's what I started to imagine reading this book. And once or twice, because both Dream Quests did the same thing. We end up with, we have these characters that aren't really developed in any significant way. We kind of get like a like a slasher movie feel, where like, oh yeah, these two characters are telling the story of this book that they found. And inside the book is a guy who's telling a story of some stuff that did or didn't happen to him. Oh, okay. Do any of these characters grow or change or even have an interesting personality? No, not really. Are there any cool, good quips? Any good dialogue that's like really like, ooh, this is tense and interesting? Or even like, oh, this kind of illuminates what kind of person this character is supposed to be. Not really. There's very little agency by the characters in this book. They kind of stumble into everything that they find, and the world is just going all on around them. And maybe that's part of the theme that Hodgson wanted to point out. But, there's also like this god of death theme thing that's going on. There's all kinds of weird stuff going on in this book. There's a lot of these ideas that were, I would say, kind of newish at the time that Hodgson was writing. At the same time, 120 years later almost, these ideas have been done and redone and redone and redone so many times by so many subsequent authors that me as a modern reader is like, oh, I've seen this before. Yes, the thing that I've seen before is newer than the thing I'm looking at now, but like, if Hodgson... But at the same time, all of these cool ideas are held together with kind of subpar glue, if that makes sense. And not enough of it, too, where it's like, here's a thing, and then here's another thing, and there's like just this slight thread of connection between them. And you're like, well, I mean, this feels like a second story, with just the same character narrating it to me. Connect it up, make it make more sense to me, or make it have some kind of an overarching effect on this character's view of the world or something, anything. Anyway, and at the end, of course, you get to the ending of this book, and it's like, oh yeah, well, we're done, and you're like, wait, what? That's it? You're done? When you get to the ending of this book, you've gone through all of this stuff of these guys finding this manuscript and reading it, and all this weird stuff. And, all these weird rumors that they're getting and all this crazy stuff going on. And then the book just ends. And you're like, well, and it's just done. Final thoughts. If you are a Lovecraft fan and you want to read the things that Lovecraft thought were interesting, go check out this book. If you are an old sci-fi buff or an old Weird Tales buff, go check out this book. If you're curious about how this 1908 book put in so many strange ideas but connected them together so poorly, go check out this book. If you want something that's going to be genuinely entertaining, I would say probably you might want to give this one a miss. But like as something that is a good example of new ideas published in old times, it has some interestingness to it. And it does have some literary value. There's just enough things where it's like, this was kind of a stupid choice for the author to make, where you end up kind of 6 of one, half dozen of another. So anyway, that's all I've got. The House on the Borderland by William Hope Hodgson, 1908. Link in the description for where you can go read this. It's deep in the public domain at this point, so go check it out if you are curious, or if you want to read something that Lovecraft said, was perhaps the greatest of all of Mr. Hodgson's works. And yeah, that's what I've got. It was good enough for Lovecraft to put it into his essay on supernatural horror. So, for what it's worth. That's what I've got. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.